Shirley Adams here to show you this jacket with all its inside uglies exposed. I might take a jacket off and I therefore want it pretty inside. This is program 11 of the Sewing Connection Series 2, and we're going to line this coat to cover up what should not show, to make it more luxurious and to let it slip on and off comfortably. Remember last time how we cut out the lining using the outside coat pattern, minus the facings, plus 1 1/4 inches for seams where the facing and lining meet. And at the center back we added an ease pleat to move arms without restraint. And at the shoulder and the sleeve cap we subtracted a 1/2 inch since this will fit under the shoulder pad against the body. So to get going on this, that's what we did. We cut it up and we put it all together. So the lining is now all stitched together and it looks like this. Stitch it together, press everything open, and also when you're on the ironing board, give this a little tug right here at the center back. Remember that ease pleat? Give that a little tug so that you can just press that too. And then also you want to stay stitch around the back of the neck. Nowhere else but just around the back of the neck. Stay stitching is that line of stitching you make about a 1/2 inch or so from the edge. And the reason for that is because we're going to have to clip that. And stay stitching is reinforcement, so you want it to be reinforced before you clip. So after I have that reinforcement in, then I can just go ahead and clip it here because I have that line. And now the reason I need to clip this is because this is an inside curve as it goes around the neckline, whereas the facing that we're going to sew it to is an outside curve, and those two different curves will only come together if you clip the one that's pulling, which would be this one. So be prepared to do that. Then to get the two together, to set in that lining, we're going to start at the shoulders. And let's see how it goes. This is going to be right and this left, so I'll start here with this right side and this right side, and I'm going to put them together at the shoulders, and it doesn't matter what the seam does out here at the edge. What matters is what happens in here at the 5/8 stitching line is what I'm trying to get together. So right here at this 5/8 line, get it adjusted here a little better. So that's where I'm going to pin that. And if you have any doubts at all about the way this is going to fit, it's a good idea to pin baste it, which means putting your pin sideways like this. And if you do that all around, you can turn it right side out and see how it fits before you actually do the sewing. But because I know this is going to fit just fine, I'll go ahead and just pin mine in for the purpose of sewing it in. So here we go with a few pins, and because these are curved in different directions, you need quite a few. But anyway, you always start there at the shoulder to get that pinning done. And you pin all the way down to the bottom. After we once get past the curves, then we don't need as many pins. Here's a pin. Now be sure, because these are bias areas, they're a little bit curved here, and they're bias areas. So be sure when you're pinning this that you don't pull either side, because you don't want to do any stretching. So be careful about the way you hold these fabrics, and you pin it all the way down to the bottom as far as you can get. Now what I've already done on this jacket, of course, is hem it, and everything's all finished except for putting this lining in. So it's just a matter of getting that pinned in. Then I want to go back to the shoulder and pin up to the center back. To start at one end and pin around to the other end isn't a good idea, because you want to get this all evenly balanced, and it might not work if you do it all in one operation. So now I start again at the shoulder, and I'm going to move over toward the center back, and see how those little clips all open up because the inside and outside curve are conforming to the same shape. And anytime something's kind of slippery like this and kind of thin as this lining is, I usually weave my pins in and out a couple of times just because it holds a little bit better, so that you don't lose those pins before you get to them when you're stitching. Then after this is all pinned, and I'm not going to do the whole thing, I'm just here at the center back. I'm not going to do the whole thing for the sake of saving time. I'll just do half of it here. But you would pin in the whole thing all the way, and you do that by starting again at the left shoulder and going toward the center, and starting at the left shoulder and going down to the bottom. Now that we have this pinned in, we're ready to stitch, and I'm going to start stitching it. You'd start on one side and go around to the other, but since I only pinned half of it, I'll just start here at the center back and go down to the front. So 5/8 line is what I want, and I'm all ready to stitch now. And see if I can get that down in position here to work on it. Okay. And then again, be careful, don't stitch over pins if your machine doesn't like to do that. Take them out just before you come to it if you need to. And get it adjusted. If you have a needle down position, go ahead and adjust that needle down so that every time you stop, it'll hold the fabric in place. Okay, and when you get all the way down to the bottom then, and I'm almost there, then we're ready to go. And take the pins out. And then I'd actually want to press this a little bit, but just for the sake of saving time, I'm not going to do this. I'll instead go to another jacket that's partially done. So at this time, what I would do is turn it right side out like this, and you can see how everything does fit well. And I would give this just a slight press here with the iron. Don't give it a real hard press, just a slight press will be fine. Then I'm going to do something a little strange maybe, but it's going to go over my elbow. And this is where you need to stand up and do this. I'm going to put this over my elbow on the right shoulder, and I'll put my hand inside the left shoulder. And the reason I want to do this is to make sure everything's fitting nicely in there. And then I would do some pinning right here under the arm, and I need to get the sleeves in before I do that pinning, so let me push a sleeve in. Okay, maybe I'll put it over on this arm instead since I have this sleeve pushed in. Right here under this arm, I want to do a little pinning, and I'm going to do the same pinning up above the arm. Now remember that when we put that coat all together and we trimmed it under the arm so it was only a 1/4 inch high right here in this place, well, the 1/4 inch seam is right here, and this is what I'm aiming at right here, the 1/4 inch seam. Something else I did that I didn't tell you about, and I better real quickly, is when I stitched this sleeve in of the lining, I made 5/8 inch seams everywhere else, but right here under the arm only, I made just a 1/4 inch seam. And the reason for that is because in that lining, it's going to have to travel over that seam and down into the sleeve. So that's why there's a little tiny seam there in the lining, and the seam in the coat has been trimmed off. And what I'm doing, I have done here, I've already pinned that together so that I can do a few hand stitches there. Then I also would want to with it over my hand and elbow, I would want to put a few pins here so I can do a few hand stitches here above the arm. And you can see I've already done that on this jacket, so it's caught here. I can't get it loose in any way, it's all caught. So the same thing under the arm. You want to stitch that, just a few stitches. They really won't show. Here they are. Maybe you can see a couple of dimples there where I've stitched around under the arm, but they really won't show. Nobody's going to look at it that closely at least, so it'll be all right. Now if you're really hard on clothes, you might want to do a little stitching all the way around the seam. I never do. I find it sufficient to just do a little tacking there at the top and at the bottom, and that'll do the job. It'll hold it in place so that your lining won't shift around anywhere, so that nothing can move. Then after we have that done, then we need to put it on a hanger. So without doing any more on that jacket, I'll just put it aside and put it down on the, or put it over on a hanger. And here I have this on a hanger. And the reason we're going to hang it up after we have that tacked at the shoulder and under the arm is because now we want to see how it hangs down inside the coat. If you would just put this down flat on the table, it wouldn't be hanging just right. It must go on a hanger and do the rest of this work, or a little bit of this work right now while it's hanging. Okay, then what I want to do is get this smoothed over. Now notice inside this jacket I have a little trim. And as you're sewing in the lining, or before you sew it in, if you want to have a little trim between lining and facing there, you may do this. What this is just a bias strip of some pretty fabric that gives a little tiny trim here. Don't do anything very bulky, because you know what the cleaners will do later then, as they give this a good hard press, you're going to have a ridge showing where that little trim is. So I always do, if I'm going to put any kind of a trim in there, I just do something real flat. But that would be done before you sew the lining in. Okay, then what I want to do is smooth all the lining back inside here and from the outside wherever it falls nicely, and I'll get it to fall smoothly. I'm going to put some pins to hold the lining in its proper position. And do these pins not down at the bottom but up above the hem, because they would be in your way if you do it down in the hem area. So do this all the way around the coat, do all these pinnings, and do the same thing at the sleeve. You have the sleeves down inside, so also pin those sleeves, and I usually start out right where a seam is to make sure those seams meet. So I'll put the seams together right here on the inside of the arm and get that to hang just right, and do some pinning right there also above the hem so it's up out of your way. And once you have these sleeves pinned as well as the whole jacket pinned, then you can take it down off the hanger and put it down on the table and do the rest of the work there. Okay, then what happens on the table is this. We are going to get rid of this extra lining. Last week I said as you were cutting out the lining you only needed to have it a ½ inch longer than your jacket. Well, this one, just to be completely safe, I cut the same as the original jacket. I cut it all the way down, but in the original jacket the hem's turned up. So now I don't want this much extra fabric. Ordinarily lining is not that expensive and it's not that tragic. Therefore, if you cut extra lining to begin with and cut it off, I would rather do that as an insurance policy to make sure that I don't fall short later on. Because as I told you last time, sometimes patterns shortchange you a little bit in the lining. And if this ends up too short originally, like shorter than the jacket already, how are you going to turn up a hem and still have an ease plate down there so that it won't pull up awkwardly? That's why, just to make sure, leave it there. Another place that I would leave and not cut, even though lining or patterns usually advise you to, if you have a vent in the back of this jacket, they usually say cut here on one side, whichever it is, left or right. They say cut this out here and they give you a square line to cut out. I would not do that. I would just leave both sides in if there's going to be a vent and wait until this time when you're doing the hem, and then you can eliminate the excess if you don't want it. But always be safe. Don't cut anything that you may be sorry for later, or it may involve cutting out a new lining. Then after you have this all pinned as we did on the hanger, and after it's down flat on the table, I'm going to cut off this excess. So that's just a matter of leaving about a ½ inch there and cutting it off. Use a little seam gauge. I'm going to eyeball this and just cut it off a ½ inch longer. So here's a ½ inch longer than the jacket. And I'll cut this off. And I would do the same thing all the way around on both sides and in the sleeves, because I want none of this beyond a ½ inch. That's all that's needed. So after that's gone, and I've also already cut it off in the sleeves and on the other side of the jacket, then you're ready to fold up the hem. And again, this can just be flat on the table or on your lap, wherever. It doesn't need to be hanging anymore. You're in good shape once you have that row of pins. And this row of pins that we put on when it was on the hanger is so important that you don't take it out till you're completely finished and have given it a little bit of pressing to the bottom. Don't touch the pins. Leave them there, this set of pins that you have there, so that it holds in place. Okay, then after you have that all nicely pinned and everything trimmed off and it's all smooth in there, we're going to fold this up. I'm just going to fold this out of the way as though it's not there. We're going to fold this up so that it's a ½ inch shorter than the jacket. You do everything in ½ inches. We cut it off so that it was a ½ inch longer. Now I'm going to fold it up. What that would be is an inch, so that it turns out to be a ½ inch shorter. And I'm going to put another row of pins in, and these pins will go just about a ½ inch up from the edge. So these pins are going to be on the lining side. The other pins were out on the coat side, so they won't be in your way at this time. And we'll put these pins just as often as you need them all along the way here, folding it up as we go. Now this should fit in very nicely, because you remember you use the same pattern for the lining as you used for the coat. If it does not fit, see right now where the trouble is. If it's too large or too small, see where the problems lie. and decide, well, do I want to take it back to the machine and make it a little tighter seam here or a little looser seam? Because you won't have to do it in the whole jacket. You would, for instance, this I have the seams not quite matching. This doesn't bother me if the seams don't quite match here. The lining seam is over here and the coat seam is over here. That doesn't match me or bother me at all. What bothers me is if it doesn't fit smoothly in there. That's where the tragedy can occur. So as long as it fits smoothly, it will be all right. I will only change the seams if it doesn't fit smoothly. But as long as everything else is working out, I'm going to leave this alone. If I did have to correct that, I wouldn't do the whole seam. I would only do it, until it tapers off, maybe around the waist. I would only do the lower part of it to get it to fit exactly, because above there from the waist on, it really doesn't need to. Something else that you see inside some of these jackets is, especially if it has a front and a side front, something else that you might see is a little pleat taken here. And I'll show you this right now. Now the jacket I have on the table, the navy lining down here, the seam is stitched all the way up. It is not stitched all the way in this other jacket. Now this one is shaped the same way in that it has a front piece and a side front piece. There's the seam that joins them. And yet with this piece, I cut the lining as one. I just sort of overlapped it. And I don't think I pointed that out when I was cutting out the lining last week, but I actually did just overlap that side and the front piece. And here's where the extra fabric came in then. Instead of making a seam, you can see I've just made a tuck there so that it fits at the waist. And this is quite all right. If you look inside any commercial suit that you'll have at home, that you'll probably see a tuck similar to this instead of the seam stitched so that it fits exactly. So it does work out very nicely to do it that way. Okay, then we keep folding all this up until we are all the way around this front. And I'm going to shift that pin slightly and keep turning this under. And then after we have all this done, we're going to be ready to do some hand stitching to hem it up. Now there are many other ways to do a lining, but in classes, people have found this to be easy and have found it to be successful. I was teaching tailoring classes in a university for a good many years, and so many of those students had never done any sewing before they got to college, and after one beginning course with a couple, 3 garments there would come into a tailoring class. So inexperienced people, you especially need to think of what works for them, what can they do easily, and the things that I'm showing I found did work easily for everybody, and they could find success with it. Okay, after we have these pins all the way around, if there's a vent, do it there. If there's the other side of the jacket, do the same thing in the sleeves. Get those folded up inside also. So I would just fold them like this. You usually can't make the mistake of turning it wrong side out in order to fold this up, because see how the sleeve, the heavy sleeve, the fashion fabric sleeve, is going to buckle then, because it would be larger than the lining if you force it to the inside. And so try to do it this way, just with it in shape, but taking that lining under so that it's also a 1/2 inch shorter, and do the same pinning there. Then after you have all this finished, you're ready to do some stitching. And I think I have a needle back here. Yes, I do. Okay. Here's a needle so I can do a little stitching, and what that stitching is going to be is not right down here at the bottom. Remember I showed you last week the horrible look if you have lining that's too short and it therefore makes your sleeve crinkle up like this. As you see, I'm shocked sometimes to see this even in the most expensive departments in clothing stores, because they somehow haven't allowed enough length there in the lining, and so this is what results. So this ease pleat is what I am right now building in. So to have this all pinned up like this and to do the stitching, because I was showing in this example that little extra there, I'm not going to worry about closing this up. I'm just going to start at the corner. So starting here at the corner and getting my knot hidden underneath, I'm going to come out here, and right at the corner you need no ease pleat. It's all right there to have none, because after all this is stitched solidly, so there's no way it's going to pull up there and shortchange you. But as soon as you take a couple of stitches right here at the corner, and this is just stitching in between layers, and you want to be very careful here that you don't stitch to the outer layer of the coat at all. but this seems to be an easy way for everybody to do it. I don't advise folding it up like this because you might catch both layers of the lining, and you don't want to do that. I would rather just sort of work up the top layer of the lining out of the way, because I only want to catch that layer of lining that's against the hem of the coat. So with this lining, you can see I'm going through just the hem of the coat. I'm not going to the outside at all. You don't want to catch the needle to the outside, or it'll look bad and it'll produce dimples, or you can directly see the thread, one or the other. But it's just like this, pulling the lining up out of the way, getting between the layers of the hem with your needle, and then coming up, about every 3/8 of an inch maybe will be fine, 1/2 inch. These don't need to be tiny stitches. And once we have this going all the way along, you're going to be in good shape. So after you have all of this done all around, and this is a good time if you're going to do this hand stitching, it's kind of a good time to sit and watch a movie while you're doing it. It doesn't need full concentration. You can do this in your lap. You don't need to do it on a table at all. And once it's all finished, I'll just put this needle in to hold it in place here. But once it's all finished, then you can take out this row of pins. They no longer matter to you at all. Do not take out these pins yet. They still do matter. So after it's all finished, you can see there is a nice ease pleat here. And if I would take out the other pins, then I'd wonder where this ease pleat should be. So before you take out this outside row of pins, that's when you want to bring the iron over and just give this a slight crease all along the bottom of it. The pins will all be gone from there at that time, so just give this a little bit of a crease, and then after you have that crease, and do the same thing in the sleeves. After the sleeves are all done, press them also, and you might use a sleeve board or a seam roll or something to put inside to do that pressing, but get all that nicely pressed so that you have that ease pleat in the lining there. Get that pressed before you take that outside layer of pins out, and then you can take them out and you're finished with the jacket. So it really isn't all that difficult to put in a lining. Now there are other ways to put it in, of course, besides this. Some of the other ways you might have to work with this I have down here. Here's one, for instance, that I'm in the process of making. And with this one, because I had this underlining inside instead of interfacing, or it's really interfacing used as underlining, but there is going to be no other anything in there. And because with this one, the whole collar, upper and lower layers, were already there, this lining is going to be put in a little different way. So sometimes this is an alternative, and that is by stitching all the facing, the back and front facing, to the lining first, and then putting this in your coat all as one unit. So that's another possibility. If I would do it that way, again, it would be right sides together, and I would pin all this down to the bottom, and then pin it here, ignoring the collar, just keeping it out of the way, and I'd pin it around here, and then finishing it up would be relatively the same thing. After I have all this stitched, pinned, stitched, and pressed in place, then you would also hang it up to get the pins there on the outside so that the lining hangs just right before you finish up. After this is finished, then I'm going to add a little band to the bottom of it. So on this one, I'm not even going to worry about a hem in it. That's why it's not hemmed in advance, because it will have an elastic band around the bottom that goes on last. So this is just a different instance, a different set of circumstances, but this will work out very well in this one. I have another one here in Ultra Suede, and with this one, because on this Ultra Suede I have raw edges all the way around the outside, there are no seam allowances in there at all. They're all just raw edges there everywhere. What I did to put this together is do the whole outside of the jacket in one piece, and then I had the whole inside of the jacket and the facing together in another piece. And here it was putting wrong sides together. Here was, for instance, the jacket, the outside layer. Here was the inside layer with its lining and with its facings already attached. And then it was just putting the wrong sides of these together and pinning them and stitching around the edges, because raw edges are used everywhere in this. There are no seam allowances. Now this is only with the suedes that you do this. You wouldn't do it with any woven or knit fabrics, of course. They have to have seam allowances inside. But anyway, it makes kind of a nice alternative. Also, since this one doesn't have any seam allowances, it doesn't have any hems. This raw edge of the sleeve is exactly where the edge of the coat will end up. So what I did for this is make the lining a little bit longer. The facing, which will substitute for a hem, is then attached to the lining. Everything's in one piece there. And then when I put this together, I'll just put the edges of the facing and the hem, or the edge of the jacket, up together, and the lining will form an ease plate. So that won't be a problem either. We always want that ease plate, though, in the bottom of the sleeves and the bottom of the lining, so that it will work out just right. Now you can see this was really not a difficult job, this lining business. When it's finished, you'll feel like the neatest kid on the block, which reminds me that next time we're going to have a block party. Color blocking, that is. And if you haven't done any, then it's time you try your hand. See you next time.